we visited 42 mine sites around the world, and we identified a total of 2,500 potential fatal accidents that were literally sitting under the surface.
Corrie Pitzer, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's a pleasure, Mark. Very interested to hear how we can contribute to your podcast.
Yeah, well, I'm sure a lot of our audience is probably familiar with your work. It's been hugely influential in the space of safety. Obviously, you're the founder of Safemap International. You've done a lot of work speaking all across the globe on a lot of key principles in the space, and also really innovated in many ways. I think a good way, rather than me giving you an introduction, would be just to have you walk us through kind of how you got started and how you got to where you are today.
Sure. Well, as some of your audience may recognize, I have an accent, not a very strong one, but I have an accent, and it's originally from South Africa. Well, that's where I grew up. I studied industrial psychology in South Africa, and I then basically, my first ideal was to get into HR with that kind of background, but it didn't quite work that way. I started as an HR manager for a big mine in South Africa, and very quickly I was moved from that function into safety by the manager. He did me an enormous favor by saying to me, you're not going to sit here in an office. You first have to obtain a blasting ticket, which meant I had to go work underground for almost a year to be qualified as a miner, a blaster. And that was probably the biggest eye-opener for me in my career about safety and risk, because we worked, thousands of feet underground in a stope that's 39 inches high, extremely risky, and learned probably the principles that I adhere to today in terms of my thinking, if I connect the dots, all going back to that. I then became the group safety manager for this company, which was then known as Gencor, which is today known as BHP, which is a very large organization. It had 120,000 people in it with 60 odd mines. And a seminal moment in my career there was a mine disaster. The mine was called Kinross Gold Mine, and 177 people died in that disaster underground. A fire underground, trapped. I mean, these mines are huge, enormous mines, thousands of people working underground, and if anything goes wrong, it is catastrophic. And incidentally, this mine was a 5-star rated, safety rated mine by the Frank Bird system at the time, the International Loss Control Institute, which was quite shocking. That started a massive shift in my thinking, how we are failing in the real terms, yet we have all these systems and capacities operating in the organization. And I then embarked on a project with this company, 62 mines, and we introduced what you probably today would refer to as a HOP process. But it was based on the principles of Edward Deming, and we had a 5-day process where 2 days we focused on serious injury and failure risk. We had teams going out in different workplaces looking for serious injury, fatal risk potential, catastrophic risks as well. Came back and we did a collation of information, and then for the next 3 days we had the management team engaged in a HOP process where they would be listening to feedback about a culture survey that we've done prior to the event. We had learning teams operating in the organization for 3 weeks prior. They would look at different areas of failure or potential failure. One of the things was decluttering the safety management system, for instance. That was what the presentations were all about. And that happened over 3 days. And so this process was then rolled out at 62 mines. And it was a rather dramatic shift in this organization at the time. From the worst performing organization in fatal accidents to the best performing organization in fatal accidents in the whole country. And they started there with a whole focus on critical risk management. That, and what you today see is, you know, SIF risks and all this talk, that was started there in 1986 to 1992. And so I then went to Australia after that for a contract with them. I resigned, became a consultant, and then went to Australia, lived in Australia for about 15 years, where these kind of concepts were also introduced in the mining industry in Australia. And then I moved to Canada 12 years ago. And from there I started, you know, really building out Safemap and focusing it into a bigger organization. And we focus very much on the field of the new view of safety, SIF risks, and we have two companies, Safemap and Riskmap, and we kind of align these two focus areas. So that's as short as I can get into backing into my career so far.
You know, Corrie, it's quite the journey, and something that really stood out to me when I was listening to some of your talks and reading through what Safemap does is just the quantity and quality of processes that you guys have identified that really stand out as effective in the safety world. You mentioned the HOP process, but something else that I thought was really intriguing was the idea of being paralyzed by safety. And in one of your talks, you mentioned, you gave an example of the 100 Years' War, which I thought was just fantastic. I was wondering if you could maybe just run us through that story example and also break down what paralyzed by safety means.
Okay, yeah, that's very interesting, and I love that concept. And there was 100 years of war between the French and the English way back in the 1400s, I think it was. And there was a process of evolution of weaponry, a very simple evolution. And the evolution was that the two groups of warriors would run into each other, they would clash, and they would bang each other with swords and clubs, and until the the English came up with the idea of the archers. So they had the archers shooting at the opponents. But then at the same time, the French came up with the idea of horsemen. You know, they're going to put guys on horseback, and they're going to rush into the battlefield and disturb the whole process towards their benefit. So the English then started to focus their archers on the horsemen to keep them out of the battle. And so the French came up with the idea, well, we better protect ourselves from these archers because they kill our soldiers. So they started wearing leather protection to stop the arrows from going through. And when the English saw that, hey, that's not good. So they developed the new missile of the time, you know, the strong bow, and the 4 feet long arrow with steel tips or metal tips that would penetrate the leather protection. Now that led to the French developing metal armor. And so they had this famous battle where the French would come in all dressed up in metal armor on their horses, could hardly get on the horses because they were so heavily weighted down. And as they were running into the battle with their horses, the English started shooting the soldiers, but they can't get, the arrows don't penetrate. So they started aiming at the horses. So the horses started getting killed or shot. So these soldiers, the French soldiers, fell off and they couldn't get up because they were so heavily weighted down by this armor. And then the French lost that battle and the English won the throne. Now, the analogy is they were paralyzed by their protection. And if you look at the history of safety over decades and maybe even centuries, what we started doing is we increased protection. Whatever happens, if you look at an accident that happened, what they look back at is what is the causes of this, and the whole industry of PPE, you know, evolved from protecting the worker in the workplace. But not only that, now we started also with systems protections and all kinds of controls And if you look at the modern era, and you look at, okay, it's all about critical controls for serious risks in the organization, that's all well and fine. But as you increase that protection, you're increasing the paralysis. And I always love to use the analogy of a simple analogy that we all know very well. That's the analogy of a pedestrian at a pedestrian crossing. If you watch their behavior, you can see the whole paralysis alive and well in people, because no one pays attention to any movement of any vehicles. The risks are out there, but because of this perception of protection, people just automate their behaviors. I've seen I've seen a lady one day with a pram pushing the baby across the pedestrian crosswalk, and she was watching something on an iPhone, and the little kiddie was walking next to her, and they just walked across. And what was shocking to me for that moment was the previous traffic light where I stopped. Somebody went through the red light. And what is the chances of somebody running through this pedestrian crossing? And it's because of this paralysis. Now, if you look at the broader picture, and there is a concept that is not probably very popular amongst the safety professionals, and that's called risk homeostasis. And that is, as you increase protection, you increase risky behavior. If you decrease protection, you increase safe behavior. So look at the behavior now, the analogy of the pedestrian, as against the behavior of the jaywalker. How does a jaywalker cross that road that they run across? They look left and right, and they're all alert, and they dash over, focused, as against the pedestrian that is completely oblivious of risks now. Now, use that analogy for the whole of the organization. The organization can be like that themselves, and that's where I think we've lost a little bit of traction in terms of our safety focus, that we are overemphasizing control of risks and underemphasizing the discovery of risks, so that people can constantly see changes in risk all the time and become much more aware and alert, like jaywalkers. And that's the paralysis by protection is probably our biggest scourge in safety, because we're just battling down that road. We're not changing direction. We're increasing control as we go. Technology now, it's all about technology, digitization and digital twins. And, safety is going to be so much improved because of technology. Well, actually, we are probably going to be more exposed, as I see it.
It's so interesting that you bring up the concept of risk homeostasis. I've heard countless examples of this, and it's not so intuitive at first, but a good example that I heard was seat belts when they were first introduced. Initially decreased the accidents, but right away afterwards, you've seen that people started driving erratically and took more and more risks as a result because they felt safer. So I think that there's a real sort of balance to the protections that we're placing versus what the actual results are. I'd like to dig in a little bit more into how do we identify the right amount of protections to put in place. So when you're coming into an organization and maybe you see they don't have enough or they have too many, what is that sweet spot, or what does that look like?
Yeah, I think that's probably one of the most complex questions I've ever been asked. How do you find the sweet spot between those two areas? I don't think there is a rule that can tell you that, because organizations, for the first and most important reason, risk is a dynamic, morphing process in an organization. It is not a fixed matter. And this is typically how we see risk. We have a risk register. These are the things that can seriously injure and kill people. And we have controls for those things. And we build controls on top of controls for those things. What is sorely missed is that even the risks we know about is constantly shifting. in appearance, in location, in likelihood, in potential impact. All of that is a dynamic movement of risks in an organization. So if you look at a risk matrix that people use in terms of quantifying risk or trying to qualify and quantify risk, it is a complete misplacement of what risk really is. Think about risk, and this is my opinion. Think about risk as this massive soup in an organization that bubbles and bubbles up, and sometimes it pops through the surface and you have an event. For most of the time, there is an enormous... Now, let me tell you why I say this. I've been engaged by a large mining company, and we had a process based on what I did for Gencor way back in South Africa, where teams would go out and identify risks in the workplaces, talking to workers and challenging their thinking. And we visited 42 mine sites around the world, and we identified just in each 1 week in each of those places a total of 2,500 potential fatal accidents that were literally sitting under the surface, some almost nearly happening in front of our eyes. Yet the organization, during that time, 120,000 people, 130,000 people at the time, only 2 fatal accidents, and I say only 2 with reservation, but there were thousands of potential fatal accidents. So why did they not happen? Not because of the controls we have in place, partly that, but because of random variation in risks and random controls and protection implemented by people. People saved the day so many times. I can give you amazing stories of what happened. Now, therefore, how do you know whether there's enough risk control in an organization, too much or too little? You would have to have a process in place, a dynamic process in place to chase that up, to constantly focus on that, and to dynamically look at your risk environment. And then I would say less is more, less is better, because we reduce complexity like that, and we reduce overlay of one risk over another or one control over another, and we reduce this risk homeostasis issue. So I like to work with the concept of super controls for risks. The top 4, if you have a risk working at heights, you look at the risk controls that we put in place. There's probably organizations that would have 12 controls for that. I say identify the 4 most critical super controls and make sure those 4 controls are alive and well 24/7. Not have 12 controls that are sometimes functional and sometimes not. And because you have this idea, oh, I've got many layers of protection, some of them are allowed to fail. No, that is a weakness in the system. I like to think about, if you know there's no backup. So I like the American mountaineer Alex Honnold that scale rocks without safety gear. He knows if he fails, he's dead. So what does he do? He is absolutely, totally focused. The detail of his preparation for that climb is incredible. The risk focus that he has is incredible. That's, to me, the analogy. I'm not saying let's take out all safety protections, but less is definitely more, in my opinion.
So let's look at the factors that we have, and instead of throwing all of them into a bucket and doing a bunch in a mediocre sense or overdoing it, we pick the ones that have the highest impact, and that will lead to the greatest amount of success. Is that kind of the...
That's exactly the analogy that I think is working, yeah.
Something else that stood out to me there, you mentioned that you really highlighted that, people aren't always the problem. They can also be part of the solution, which I often, unfortunately, seems to go really not said in the world of safety. I think far too often people are highlighted as the problem instead of the part of the solution. Can you speak a little bit more about how we get people more engaged in being part of that solution?
So, and I think that's been a big shift in the thinking from the old view of safety, traditional view of safety, behavior-based safety, caused the thinking in management's eyes that workers are the problem. And we need to, and this is all the whole era of human error, and we try to eliminate human error and automate things, etc., put controls on top of that, etc. The newer thinking is that humans are the solution, or more correctly, humans are part of the solution, because there's now, that's even gone overboard now. I see a lot of postings on LinkedIn, almost just that statement: humans aren't the problem, they're the solution. Well, my statement in that, most of the time, humans are not the problem, but some of the time they are. Most of the time, they are the solution, but some of the times they're not. And we got to be very careful in this balancing of how do we look at the role of the human worker, the frontline worker. And I think that's where it starts to go wrong. If we say all the solutions lie with the frontline worker, it's not true. There's some of the solutions are there. And the reason I say this, in this exercise we did with this mining company that we did out, there was a lot of times when the workers had no idea even what real risks they're facing, even though they worked there for many years, and they could not be expected to know the risks, And as we started to challenge them, and we used an interesting little lens, I would call the risk lens, and there were 6 factors we challenged them with and say, what risks do you think is being overlooked here? Well, they're overlooked because we haven't seen them. And then when they start to look for risk in that environment, and we sit and work with them and challenge them, it's amazing what they start seeing, because they have the expertise of that work. Then they say, okay, what risks could be underestimated here? And then that, elevated a lot of risks in their eyes. What risks flow from taking shortcuts? What shortcuts do we take here? And most of the time, the shortcuts they take is not because they're lazy, it's because they have to, because to get the job done. So those 3 areas already started to highlight amazing amounts of risk identification, risk discovery. And then you have the systemic side. What risks are being tolerated here in the system? What risks are inherent in the system? And what risks flow from work pressure, work demands, task complexity. Now, when you look at risk in those 6 areas, you actually start to see things that they probably haven't seen before. And this is how we discovered those kind of 2,500 risks that, could be potential fatal. And we use that in our systems that we develop for organizations, use that lens. So in terms of the overall, balancing act of safety, so the more risk we discover and get alertness and awareness of those, the more balance I think we have a risk management process in place, rather than have a fixed static process of just looking at controls and not getting to that dynamic process in the organization, and understanding risk as a dynamic entity in the entity is also not the right word, but you know what I mean.
And you mentioned the fact that they hadn't even seen the risks that they didn't see, or they didn't know what they didn't know. And part of this touches on, you're going beyond checklists to a certain extent. You're almost building a mindset of safety. I don't know, what would you call it? There's a culture of safety. Would that be the word?
I'd rather say culture of risk. And there's different terms that have been used over time. Chronic unease. Let's have people chronically uneased. A bit of I'm not so easy with that concept. Here's how we define safe. I mean, if you the way we define safe, what is safe in an organization, is fundamental to the way we approach safety. And most people, even though we say no, we don't, most companies still define safe as the absence of accidents. And that is just a generic statement, a generic definition that we all know about. Now, the new view of safety says, no, we should define safety as the presence of capacity or the presence of control. Now that, in my opinion, is also inadequate, because a lot of organizations, like Kinross mine disaster, 177 people died, were a 5-star mine. They had enormous amount of capacity and control in place. And if you look at modern disasters, Deepwater Horizon, and all these organizations, they were advanced in safety and capacity and controls, which fundamentally faltered. So I don't think that's an adequate definition. So the definition that I work with is safety, or SAFE, is the readiness to respond to risks relentlessly. And those 4 elements, each of them have a range of metrics that can be defined for them. Readiness, what is in that readiness? Well, that's a cultural readiness, that's a systemic readiness, that's a behavioral readiness, people's risk awareness, risk expertise, the expertise they develop over time. That is a readiness. And respond is, what actions are you taking immediately at the time? How do you respond to that risk as you identify them? What is the response of the organization to those risks that have been identified? And then the readiness to respond to risks. Now, the risk entity is a very complex area, because that's where it's all dynamic and morphing, and you've got to define all the capabilities of the organization and failures of the potential failures of the organization in terms of that, of the organizational process. What do we do here, and what can falter in the process? And then relentlessly. So if you look at the adding safety on to the production process is what we've typically always been doing. Our focus is to dig into the production process and optimize the production process so that safety becomes invisible. You don't have a safety system anymore. You don't have a safety stack board or a dashboard. It's all part of your production, of what you do. So that safety is a given. We don't think about safety because it's a given. And that is when it's totally embedded in the organization as a capacity then.
Special thanks to our sponsor, BIS Safety Software, one of the leading safety and compliance software applications on the market today. We wanted to shout out the team for their new Lone Worker technology, designed to provide enhanced protection and peace of mind for workers while they are working alone. It includes features like check-in schedules, automated notifications, and you can designate supervisors to receive alerts. This Lone Worker technology helps round out the full scope of their safety management software. Lone Worker is just the tip of the iceberg. See everything they have to offer at bissafety.ca. It's an interesting concept when you say that safety becomes invisible, and this kind of touches on something that I've been thinking about recently, which is that oftentimes people consider safety and productivity as 2 separate things. And unfortunately, this creates the illusion that you can be more productive if you get rid of safety entirely, or you remove as many of those barriers that it might create. But what we often don't see is, the impacts of an incident, or the impacts of all of these things that can they can set a company back so much, and then even, completely ruin a company. So it's almost like if we can bring those 2 together to see that safety really actually can help in the long term drive productivity. Is that kind of a fair assessment?
I think it comes back to the question you asked about what is the sweet spot in terms of how much safety do we need to have in place to prevent that what is likely not going to happen. And the reality is it's likely not going to happen. The chances of a catastrophic event in an organization is so minuscule, you can almost safely ignore it. And then, when it hits you, it's too late. And think about the large catastrophic events of BP, Texas Refinery, and Deepwater Horizon, and those. They almost ruin those organizations. But how many organizations are out there that are having the same potential failures and deficiencies in their organization right now, but don't have a catastrophic event? And that is like almost everyone sits with a major, if you think of any major facility like an oil rig or a mine or whatever, if you really start digging in, the chances of a catastrophic event is sometimes a second, a millimeter, or a half a meter away, feet in American terms. So those are the kind of things that you say, well, is this going to affect, if we put all of these processes into place, what are we preventing? And if you're a business and you're running close to the edge of your financial parameters, you got to be very careful how you manage that process. So, and I like to use the analogy of a hurdler, an athlete that runs the hurdles. And think about an organization as that. Typically, we would say to the hurdler, from a safety perspective, jump as high as you possibly can over that hurdle. But then we know that athlete is not going to win the race. Which athlete is going to win the race? The one that jumps as low as possible and almost touches and is just above the risk of falling all the time.
Okay.
That is the innovative side of the organization. That is the productive side of the organization. So the more fat we put into place into safety, the more we slow down the business. There's no question about it. What is the sweet spot? That is then the golden question again. Every organization has a different sweet spot, and that sweet spot changes from day to day. You don't have one sweet spot. And there's a concept that I've seen with an organization in Spain. They call it safety in motion. And I love that concept. Safety is always in motion. Safety is always created from moment to moment, from day to day, from project to project. There is no fixed safety system. There is, and if we get too heavily into that, that's when it becomes completely unproductive and not integrated and embedded into the organization. And we as a safety profession is often not contributing to the success of the organization. In the bottom line of the organization, we're a detraction from the bottom line, because we can easily go overboard with all the process, and we've done that in the past. I think there's a sense these days that we are much better now with integrating safety into the workplaces, more upstream thinking in safety, more systemic changes rather than building those controls. The French Knights protection is less so.
It sounds like, and I'm sure this is a huge part of your work at Safemap, you're going in and you need to tailor it to what is actually happening within the organization. It's not just a one size fits all for a lot of these risks and a lot of these processes, because I guess what might be overkill for one might meet the standard for another, and you can't just apply the same solution one after the other, from what I can tell.
Absolutely, and your systems have to be so flexible, so capable of change and adapting to circumstances all the time, that if you have a flexible safety, if you have a flexible organizational system in which your safety discovery, your risk discovery processes are well embedded and put upstream into the organization, you manage those things dynamically. When it starts with the planning process of a job, the focus is much more for me on those planning processes as we start a project or a day-to-day task, a supervisor's task for the next day. How much planning of the supervisor goes into identifying the potential risk points in that task for the next day for the team? Very little in reality, because we're so focused on getting the job done, and we've got all the safety systems in place that's going to catch us, the safety nets, that we almost become lazy in terms of thinking upstream in the organization. And so I think the more upstream we drive thinking, planning processes, risk processes in the organization, the more we're going to be adaptable to what's going to come and potentially come in the organization. And we're going to be much more ready for it. And that's that, coming back to that definition, readiness to respond to risk relentlessly, all the time.
Speaking of upstream and ways that we can implement safety better, something that I know that you've talked quite a bit about is leading indicators versus lagging indicators. And, you know, lagging, obviously, it has its place for measurement, but I think leading indicators is a direction that a lot of the industry is going. Can you speak a little bit about what are some of those key leading indicators that companies can be implementing to really transform their safety programs?
So yeah, so the notion of a leading indicator is probably as old as the mountains itself, and trying to get to identify leading indicators. But it's always been a futile process, because in the end, how do you know, for instance, that your training quality and quantity is contributing to safe operations? Or how many meetings you have about safety, how well you know, whatever leading indicator that we come up with, and there's scores and scores of leading indicators that people try to come up with, and we almost always resort to training in the organization and building capacities and so on. There is no way we can identify that connection between a leading indicator and the actual absence of accidents or not in an organization. Also, having said that, we cannot and we will never be able to use data, hard data, accident rates and incident rates and injury rates, to become predictive with those and to make those leading indicators, because the data sets that we get from injury rates is too weak. It's invalid, and they're invalid because they're unreliable. Because people don't want to report what they don't have to report. Near misreporting is a metric that we say, oh well, that's a leading indicator. Well, it isn't. It's a near miss is also a lagging indicator. It's already happened. A mishap happened. It just didn't have any consequences. So that's not a leading indicator. So I've started to work, and this has been almost like a lifelong effort from my side, is to see what indicators are there that we can work with. And the reality that I discovered for me was we don't have indicators in that field, risk metrics, because we don't have systems that generate those risk metrics. And I'll give you an example. We do have one. I think there's one in all organizations that anybody can look at and say, okay, let's have a look at the difference, the ratio of near miss reporting and far miss reporting. Then I have to define the concept of far miss. When I did this work for this organization, this mining company, I developed this concept of far miss there. And it is a concept that takes away likelihood out of the thinking. You don't think of likelihood. When you look at a risk, you don't think about likelihood. You just think of the possibility of things happening. And you start to think deeper and deeper into the organization. And I probably have to give you an example here. One example was this. There was a massive bag full of graphite that needs to be inserted into the production process. I won't go into the details of that. But the bag is on a hoist, and the operator would come with electrical connection to the hoist and would stand below to the side of this bag, but lift this bag up and then move it over the hoist, and it gets dumped into the production process. If that bag has a tear on the hand on the straps, that bag can come over and can spill that heavy graphite on this person and kill him. I noticed a damage to the strap. And then as I then went back to the store where they store these bags, huge storage area with bags on top of each other, they're on pallets, and the one pallet was slightly skewed. So the forklift operator would come and lift this pallet up and damage the bag below it. So the next bag is going to be loaded onto the system with a potential failure in it. That's a far miss. It is unlikely to happen, but we've now identified a flaw deep inside the system of the organization. And so now there's the ratio that I'm talking about. how many far misses gets reported against near misses. In other words, what people report that they could have not reported and no one would have known. I call that a hideable event. They can hide that away and no one would know. As against a near miss, that's something that did happen. They bumped the truck against the signpost. They have to report because there's damage. So what is that ratio? Now, there is a golden rule that I've discovered in my work. I don't say that's everywhere the case. But if you don't have 5 hideable far miss reports, hideable reports, for every 1 near miss report, if you have it in the reverse, which most people do have, you are not in the predictive range. You're not in the leading indicator range. Now you know that, for instance, your organization has got a maturity for people to, first of all, see those things. There is a risk competency in seeing those potential things, which we're normally oblivious about. That's the one aspect of it. The other aspect is we have the maturity of reporting those without fear. And people are willing to come up with potential failures, concerns. So the ratio is a simple number, 5 to 1. But it tells you so much about that organization in terms of, and to me, that's a leading indicator. Now, I have more leading indicators like that, but we had to create a system to actually generate those leading indicators. And the system we've created is called the Safe Sentry system. And that's been a big part of our work over the last 3 years, 4 years, where we developed this system of worker engagement with their risks that they see every day or don't see. And that lens I mentioned, the 6 lens, is built into an app. And the workers are using this to identify and engage with each other the risks in their workplace. They do a risk calculation. They do a verification of the controls that exist over those risks they see or absence of it. And then you can start measuring those. You can start measuring the ratio of overlooked risks and tolerated risks, for instance. That's a leading indicator. You don't want too many risks tolerated in an organization. You'd rather have them overlooked if you have to have them. So that's the area of, I think, leading indicators that we developed our work into, but it's still early days too, because there's so much that can be done now with AI to actually do much more in-depth analysis on that. And I've been talking a lot now, but I'm getting excited about that concept.
You know, that's something that I hadn't thought of before, was the near miss versus did you say far miss? Is that the term? Far miss, right. And then the fact that even if those far misses are happening, does not mean that the people who are seeing them or notice them, if they are noticing them to begin with,
yeah,
we hope they are, it doesn't mean that they're actually going to report it. And there's almost, it goes back to the comment you made that people can be the strongest link in safety, right? Not the other way around, where they're
weakest link, yeah.
Also, there's an element of psychological safety, I guess, would kind of be at the base of a lot of this, and building a safety culture where it's okay and encouraged to actually report these things.
Absolutely, and that is a function of leadership in the organization, and we all know that. But that's also as old as the mountains, you know. I guess Napoleon Bonaparte, practiced psychological safety in his military when he said, and I'm just thinking about his quote, "A leader is a dealer in hope." And if you just think about that, it is such a beautiful context of a leader is a dealer in hope. We have, as leaders, give people hope. How do we give people hope? Well, we create an environment in which they can prosper. We create an environment in which they can contribute. And this, you know, I really love the work of Daniel Pink in what is intrinsic motivation. And there are 3 elements of intrinsic motivation. If you give people mastery, you make people masters of their world, and think about safety, you develop their skills to see far misses, because it's a skill. It's not something that's going to pop up. You have to develop that skill set. That is the first aspect of intrinsic motivation. The second one is authority. You must authorize people to do their work. You must give them decision-making power. You must allow them to be flexible in their workplaces. And the third one that he says is they must share in the purpose of the organization. What they do must be meaningful. It's not, comply to the safety rules and get your job done. If you let them contribute to the fundamental purpose of the organization, you're creating people that become the strongest link in your safety chain. That is the psychological safety of it. And that's what Napoleon said. You give people, you give people hope. And that's how you do that, giving people hope. But the aspect that is often missing is the issue of mastery, risk competence. I've seen, and I've been a lifelong student of risk in my own life. When we did that discussions we actually engaged with 8,000 people in this project with this company. And from every person, we've learned so many things that they see, but also they've learned from us. We challenge their thinking in terms of seeing different things. And when you do that, you're creating a competence. And that's what I call risk competence. And going back to the hurdler that jumps over the hurdles, that's risk competence. How to take risks cleverly, smartly, effectively. The more risk we take, the more high risk, high return. And so what is that edge, that golden edge there where we say, take so much risk so we can unleash so much from the bottom line of the organization in terms of financial dollars without killing ourselves, without injuring ourselves. If we sprain an ankle, does that matter? If you scratch your finger, if you've got a little cut in your hand, does that really matter? And I know from a safety perspective, it does matter. No, it doesn't. What matters is, for me, the fundamental goal of any organization, safety professionals, we must prevent fatal and serious injury accidents. That's our job. Small accidents, they are not significant. It happens in our lives all the time. I do a lot of, handy work at my house. Do I do that without any scratches? No, I have a lot of scratches.
There's an inherent risk to everything at a certain level, but how are we going about managing that effectively? I can tell how passionate you are about the subject, and it makes me, curious, just on a personal level. You've obviously worked with so many different organizations in this field and thought about these subjects for a long time. What would you say is the biggest motivating factor for yourself personally in bringing these concepts to the world?
I think it's a personal thing, and I love to achieve, if I can be quite honest about it. I'm motivated by achievement. But the achievement I look for is in the field of safety. And I've had very early in my career experiences that probably developed this eagerness in my world to do as much as I can in the field of safety to achieve there. I was a soldier. I was an infantry soldier, and I was sent to a real war. And in that environment, things go wrong by nature. Then I started my job as an underground miner, and in that environment, things go wrong. And when I came out of that training, and I had an experience, within 6 months of my job in HR, and that's why I was taken out of HR into safety, where I had to go and bring the news to a young family that their father was killed in a mine accident in the same mine where I trained. And the two girls were 7 years old. And what I'll never forget is sitting in this living room, and the mother took the two girls, into a room behind me And I listened to how she explained to them that their father was killed that day in an accident. And what struck me was not the grief of the two kids. They were not grieving. They were just completely astounded. They were blown out of their world. And the look on those faces, I'll never forget. And it was probably there where I started developing a passion for this world. And I have a wristband that is this wristband here. And in our company, we wear this wristband as a reminder of this. And it says on the wristband, when was the last time you saved someone's life? And mine is in an African language, which says, Inilo skati wena sindisililo mpilo kalamunje madota. When was the last time you saved someone's life? And we know that we all save someone's life constantly, continuously, by just a little gesture here, an action there. But to me, that's the life goal, is bringing concepts and ideas and systems and processes to our clients, where we know it has an impact. We don't know what we don't know. We don't know what we save. But we do believe that we have contributed to significant improvements in organizations' capability to identify things that can kill people. And that, to me, is the ultimate passion of all of us in our company.
I have no doubt that you guys have had a massive impact. And it's such an important message that I think I have no doubt will absolutely resonate with everyone watching this. I know that it's resonated with me, right? And there's a lot to take away from that. What really comes across is there's a certain values and meaning that you bring in every day to this work that really helps you spread the message yourself. And I think that ultimately will, hopefully connect with, as many people as can watch this. Where can people, Corrie, find your work? We'll include links down below for your LinkedIn and your website there. Where else can people find what you're doing?
Our website is probably the safest way. Safemap is our website. And I think if people Google my LinkedIn, they can see connection there. We connect with people largely through word of mouth. We don't market our services much. I do public speaking, but that's not where we market. We don't market. We really work with larger organizations, sometimes smaller organizations, and we just go with organizations that need us, and we know that we can contribute to those organizations.
I want to help get the word out there, and hopefully this will. Corrie, thank you again for joining us today.
Absolutely pleasure, Mark. I really enjoyed it, and thank you for giving me an opportunity to chat about this.